collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Well, it's good to be back with you after the summer break, and on this week's programme we're going to look at something that's been very much in the news the last few weeks, and that is the clampdown by our municipalities on landlords who are illegally converting premises to rent out to refugees and asylum seekers and migrants. They're making a fortune on the backs of these unfortunate people by providing slum conditions. The municipalities say they will shut them down. The problem is, where will the people who are living in these slums go? And is there more to this policy than meets the eye?
You know, the problem is that this government took a decision to make the life of the people so difficult, with the assumption that if we make the life of the people miserable, they are not going to come to this island anymore. This is completely failure, because these people, they don't compare their miserable conditions with the Cypriots. They compare their miserable conditions with the war conditions back in their home, and they say these miserable conditions here are much more safer and humane than the situation back home.
If you wander down into the heart of old Nicosia, within the walls, there's no denying that what was once a vibrant area with shops, taverns and houses, many of them in a classical architectural style, now resembles a rundown ghetto. It is here that many shopkeepers have converted their premises into living quarters for migrants and refugees who can't afford rents in proper residential areas. They live in squalid, unsanitary conditions, and many still struggle to pay their share of the rent. So a lot of people applauded when the Nicosia municipality announced earlier this month that it would be inspecting premises in the area and closing those that were not fit for purpose. The problem is they offered no alternative to those refugees who suddenly found themselves without a roof over their head. I went down to the old town earlier this week to meet Doros Polikarpou. He's the director of the NGO KISA, which stands for Action for Equality, Support and Anti-Racism. Doros, when I first saw those reports that they were going to try and clamp down on these appalling premises that some people are living in, many times there's far more people than should be there. And we're talking about shops. They don't have, some of them, proper toilets, washing facilities, cooking facilities, and yet these people are paying premium rents just to have a roof over their head. Now, it's all very well to say, let's shut them down, this is illegal. I think it is in some cases. But where do these people go? Because that's the problem. If you shut down the places, they're out on the street. There doesn't seem to be any governmental or municipal support that is offering a viable alternative. So can you bring me up to date on what the situation is? Have they closed some of these places down? And where are the people going?
Well, we need to go a bit. Nicosia is a very particular case, because after 1974, after the division of the city, there was a decision to freeze the rent. This had a result that the city was more or less abandoned, the old city, and we had in the 90s the phenomenon that shops that they were used as a storage place, they were used all of a sudden by the owners or by those that were renting them, and they were turned into accommodation facilities for migrants because there was no housing policy for the huge number of migrants we had at that time.
And there still isn't a housing policy, is there?
And there, not only. After 2000, that we also became member of the EU, and we had also increased numbers of refugees and asylum seekers coming to the city, this problem became even more difficult. Since then, there is no housing policy, and this, again, when you create a gap in the market, then there are people that they take advantage of this. On one hand, there was no housing policy for migrants, and still there is no such a policy for migrants and refugees. And on the other hand, there is not an efficient regulation of how people can turn their facilities from one or to the other function. For example, I have a house and I use it for an office. I have an office, it's a mess in the city in general, with permissions on how to use the buildings. All this was tolerated, but this gave a serious space to those they wanted to take advantage and exploit migrants. What happened in reality, for example, you had a house that they rented it at the beginning of the 90s or the beginning of 2000, something like 150 euro, 300 euro in the old city, because the rents were frozen, and all of a sudden they were able to turn it into a housing facility for migrants and refugees and rent it for 3,000 euro. You can imagine between 300, all of a sudden, the rent to increase to 3,000 is an enormous exploitation there. And not only this, because these facilities, they were not ready and approved for housing. They were small spaces that they were turned into provisory sleeping facilities without the necessary sanitary, without the necessary infrastructure to accommodate these people. Now, in combination to the very restrictive policy we follow with asylum seekers and reception conditions in the last 10 years, as you know, asylum seekers are allowed only 100 euro per month for rent, and families 250 euro maximum for rent. This, of course, is not sufficient, and the authorities, they know this, that with this amount of money you cannot find proper accommodation in Cyprus, everywhere, not only in Nicosia. This increases the demand for this kind of facilities in the old city, and this actually is an incentive for those that want to abuse and exploit migrants and refugees to use this space for their own economic benefit.
It does seem to me that there are some very simple, straightforward solutions to this, one of which would be that the relevant welfare or migration service requires any migrants that are undertaking a contract to go and live somewhere to show a signed contract with how much the rent is, who the landlord is, and address of the premises, so that the authorities can go and inspect the premises to see if they are suitable. And surely it's time for a law to show that you cannot just take your garden hut and rent it out as accommodation.
Yes, well, this is very important, but before we go to the solutions, we have to see what's going on right now. So the response to the increased criticism in the society about this situation in the cities, and I say the cities, and it's not only Nicosia. We hear the mayor of Paphos, comments a few days ago, and we hear also from other big cities a similar approach. It seems as if they want to respond to it, but it goes in the wrong direction right now. Because if the decision and the intention is to come and close these facilities without offering alternative proper accommodation to these people, the only thing we are going to do is that we are going to move this difficult situation and distribute it outside the old cities, but not solve the problem.
Well, they'll be sleeping in the parks or something.
Most probably, and will be forced to pay more and more for these terrible facilities, more and more money from their own pocket, because they will not have any other option. So this will be the result. Some people will be homeless, some other people will have to pay more and be more exploited by those they want to offer them accommodation, unless the municipalities, together with the Ministry of Interior, come, and of course the Ministry of Labour and Social Insurance, they come together and they plan a policy on offering proper accommodation and support those landlords who wish really to get the permission to offer accommodation to these people under decent conditions. But it has to be a policy, a comprehensive policy, otherwise we are going again to punish the wrong people. Instead of punishing those, they take advantage and they exploit the people. Instead of punishing the authorities who close the eye for 20 years now and 10 years now for this phenomena, we are going to, again, to punish those they suffer all of these years from this, from the lack of policies and lack of planning by the competent authorities.
You're reminding me of something that I mentioned when we spoke probably about 4 years ago. And that was, I think I remember suggesting to you when there was a problem with homelessness and people sleeping in the parks, particularly in winter. There are plenty of empty buildings, some of which I think are government-owned. So why has the government, the Interior Ministry, not thought about doing a proper alteration of these buildings into, if you like, hostel-type accommodation, shared kitchens, shared bathrooms, and they take the rent money to help them run it, that these people are given, rather than having private landlords, if you want to call them that, taking the money and then saying, but I also need another 100, and these people don't have it. So, in other words, the ministry could actually be taking back the rent money it gives for providing decent accommodation.
There are plenty of ways to benefit the society and offer these people decent accommodation. We have among these refugees very qualified and talented builders, painters, that they know very well, and we, instead of not allowing them to work and live in these terrible conditions, we can offer them to contribute to this as a social contribution to improve the living conditions of this vulnerable category of people in our society. We made suggestions about this as well. You know, the problem is that this government took a decision to make the life of the people so difficult, with the assumption that if we make the life of the people miserable, they are not going to come to this island anymore. This is completely failure, because these people, they don't compare their miserable conditions with the Cypriots. They compare their miserable conditions with the war conditions back in their home, and they say these miserable conditions here are much more safer and humane than the situation back home. So we have to realize that this policy of creating inhuman conditions for the people doesn't work. This is the result of this policy. The result of this policy is that we have this terrible exploitation, these bad housing conditions for everybody, and it doesn't lead to anybody. Because as you know, the numbers increase irrespective of the fact that we, for 10 years now, we carry out this policy.
So, Doris, with no central policy in place, and the municipalities, in a sense, acting unilaterally in their own areas, it's not going to work. I mean, what's the answer?
Well, there is the Union of the Municipalities. It's a body that coordinates the municipalities. They can sit together with the ministries, with the government, with the central government, and plan a policy. And we are very willing and very happy, and not only GISA, several other NGOs, they work very closely with, and they are aware of these difficulties. We can help and contribute to this. There are definitely from the migrants and refugees people who can also contribute to this effort. There is a serious problem there, but we need to, what is the goal of it? The goal is to create decent conditions, make sure that the people use their facilities according to the permission they have by the appropriate authority, and use this space as good as possible for the people who need this space to be accommodated. If this is the aim, we need to work all together, and there are practical solutions to this. My fear is right now that the municipalities, under the pressure and the criticism and the pressure by the Ministry of Interior, we are afraid that what at the end they are going to do, they are going to try just to go after these places, close these places, and they don't care what will happen with these people. This is what I'm afraid is the tendency right now, more or less. And this, not anymore with a policy that says we don't want migrants in our area, because it's a combination. Behind this intention is also the fact that some municipalities, they want to reduce, or as our mayor said last week, very strange, impossible according to the law, to limit the housing of asylum seekers in the old city, or to abandon asylum seekers from the right to live in the old city. You can imagine that this is a combination, are various issues that they come together, and what we are afraid is that they are using the housing problems to put in place some other policies and plans they have, and not actually solving this serious social problem that we have with housing.
Right, if we're talking, and we are mostly, you mentioned Paphos, but we're talking mostly here about Nicosia, we are now in the old part of town, just a stone's throw away from a lot of these premises, and just 2 roads down, if you go down, it's a bit like a ghetto, because it is the only place that has spaces shared sometimes by 15 people in a tiny shop front, where they can put a roof over their heads and, at least when it rains in the winter or whatever, have some shelter. Now, if you start limiting them from actually living in that area, there's no way they can afford rents in some of the more salubrious areas of town. A lot of Cypriots can't afford the rents.
Well, the problem is that this area is left without any improvements. The quality of life, if you have an area that is not supported by the municipality or by the state to improve the quality of life, irrespective of who is living in that area, this is the result that you described. So you have owners who abandon their properties, they don't have the incentives anymore to renovate and improve the quality of it. And at the same time, you have a huge need on the other side, because people cannot afford to rent in any other areas of the city or of the country because of the... take in consideration what happened in Aglanja. We had the whole municipality, all the candidates nearly for the municipality, they reacted and they said, we are not going to allow to host 50 vulnerable asylum seekers in Aglanja, because this is a threat for our community. So you can imagine if you have districts like Aglanja, you have Strovolos, you have... the municipalities, they have to come together and develop a decentralized housing policy, and then it will not be a problem at all for all of us, for the people, because they are going to have improved living conditions, and for the societies as well. The numbers are not so that we are feeling that we are going to be alienated or we feel a threat about this. But everybody is feeling that I don't want them in our community.
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard. Leave them there in the next. You can imagine, and this is what there is no, I don't remember one single meeting of the municipality with the people of the area of Ohi. So the municipality is organizing meetings with Agios Andreas. The municipality is organizing meetings with the people in Kaimagli to talk with them. Why they don't organize a meeting with the people who live in the area of Ohi to discuss with them how they cannot, together with the people who live there, improve and advance the quality of life of everybody there.
Okay, and what about, finally, the Human Rights Committee at the House of Representatives?
Well, the Human Rights Committee of the House of Parliament, they have to deal with this issue. The Committee for Interior Affairs, because it's related to housing and is related to the migration and refugees issue. I think also the Parliament has to play a role in this field. But again, it's very difficult at this stage to find positive and work for positive solutions unless the government will decide to solve this problem and deal with this problem in a positive way, which means close these unaccepted houses, provided you have a planning and alternative solutions that they are better than these ones.
But that means they need to wait to close them until they have an alternative in place. At the moment they don't have, and they're going ahead and closing them.
Yes, this is exactly why I believe that the aim behind this is not so much to solve this problem in the way that we organize better this area and we offer better accommodation to the people who are in need to rent. Not all of us can afford anymore to buy a house or a flat in the city. Many Cypriots as well, they are in need to rent accommodation more and more like before. So it's time to develop policies and put in place practical plans how we can offer
affordable housing
for those in need, and also support the people who genuinely want to do their best to advance their premises and improve their conditions and give them permission to turn them from other functions into accommodation, provided, of course, that they get the necessary support in order to create the facilities.
That's also open to all sorts of scams, and it makes me think of the help years ago that was offered to people who owned listed buildings. They got grants from the government to restore those buildings, and then the rules changed. Why? Because so many owners took the grant money and didn't do a thing to their listed building. So it's again open to all sorts of problems if you do that.
Well, we need to find, there will be always cases where people will try to get advantage of it. But I believe as a rule, if you have a legal framework that will not easily allow you to change or abuse the permissions you get, then it's not going to be easy to get the permission to use it for this. It can be, for example, a clear provision in these plans that you will get the permission to use this as a housing for renting for the next 10 years. You sign for it. So if you sign for it and you take the responsibility that I will offer this facility for housing, to rent it to people for social housing, then I get access to this grant. If the permission is just I will renovate the space and in 2 years I can, without the permission from the authorities, can use it for any use I will decide again, the situation what we have right now, of course it will not help, and the people will try to take advantage of it, of such a program.
Well, it's been very much on social media, and we know most Cypriots are on social media. You've seen some pretty awful comments as well about whether or not this should happen or shouldn't happen. But we've been talking to the director of KISA, the NGO for Equality, Support and Anti-Racism, about the problems faced by asylum seekers and refugees who are living, many of them in absolutely appalling conditions, particularly in the old parts of our cities.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
In other news this week, the Interior Minister Nikos Nouris slammed Qatar's Al Jazeera network, saying they were deliberately trying to damage Cyprus politically and economically because of their ties with Turkey. This is all about what have become known as the Cyprus Papers, which Al Jazeera has been looking into with regard to citizenship for passports, which has previously drawn the attention of the European Union, but the minister says that the methodology used now has been fine-tuned and that these accusations from Al Jazeera are simply propaganda. The Labour Ministry, in the meantime, confirmed earlier this week that it is going to continue to support some types of businesses in September. That came a week before the scheduled completion of the 4 support schemes for businesses, workers and unemployed people, which had been in force until now. It's not clear, however, which businesses will be targeted for support and how long that support will last. Cyprus tourism industry, of course, as with many other holiday destinations, has suffered tremendously with the COVID-19 pandemic. And hoteliers have been accused by a lot of people here in Cyprus who were having staycations that they weren't dropping their prices enough to attract the custom. So the Deputy Ministry of Tourism has launched a special support scheme for domestic tourism, with special offers aimed to run from September 1st to November 30th, and trying to attract local people to the coast and the mountains to support the hotel industry. And finally, well, the Health Ministry keeps issuing decrees, and they change from day to day depending on the epidemiological situation, but also very much in the news over the last week or two have been the wearing of face masks in schools, which for a while it seemed were going to be mandatory even for the very young children. There was a furore, and earlier this week the ministry decided that the mandatory use for children aged from 6 to 12 would be scrapped. They are, of course, saying that social distancing must be followed, but I think everybody realised that trying to make 6-year-olds wear masks for the entire school day was probably going to be a very difficult thing to do. Masks will be mandatory, however, for 12-year-olds and upwards, and also for the general population indoors and where there are large gatherings of people. And those may stay in place well through the winter, following a government scientist's announcement that we should prepare for a winter of COVID and flu. So for the moment, it looks like social distancing and wearing masks indoors are going to be part and parcel of life for the coming months. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.